So my audience is here, and here, 5 people. All right, so thank you all so much for taking the time to come and listen to me today. And I'm really excited to just take some time to go through God's word and learn together. So when I was 18 years old, like many other high school seniors, I had my eyes set on university. I was wondering who my roommates would be, what classes I would take, friends I would make, even the kind of food that would be there at university. These were the questions that filled my thoughts as I counted down the days. When move-in day finally did arrive, I donned my oversized college-branded sweatshirt and carried with me not only far too many oversized bags and boxes, but also a lot of lofty expectations of what I thought college life would be like. I had traveled over 8,000 miles from Guinea, West Africa, where the ship I grew up on was docked, to Spokane, Washington. I was excited for this new chapter to begin. But when it actually did, that axiomatic idea that these would be the best years of your life came crashing down around me. And as I stood outside my dorm and watched my mom drive away to return to Africa, I felt the first wave of what would become a long and exhausting storm of homesickness, loneliness, and anxiety. As a third culture kid who looked and sounded American, but didn't actually know the first thing about being American, the transition from ship to shore was rocky, to say the least. As someone who grew up with very limited shopping opportunities, I remember the first time I even went to Target to buy shampoo. It was absolutely overwhelming. I must have stood in the shampoo aisle for at least 20 minutes looking at each individual bottle of shampoo. Did I want defining or nourishing, curl enhancing or frizz diffusing? These were the life questions that haunted me. I was the student who awkwardly scanned my credit card the wrong way, and I didn't understand half of the pop culture references. And once I even had to Google what clubbing was when someone asked me to go, because believe it or not, I thought it had to do with hitting something with an actual club. This was my life. My first semester at university was riddled with fear, anxiety, and the disappointment and sorrow that comes from not fitting in. And the possibility, the scarier possibility, that this new reality was the way things would always be, and I would always feel this way. My expectations had been dashed, and I just wanted to go home. I prayed for help, I prayed for deliverance, I prayed for the pain to end. But week after week, and month after month, nothing changed. Where was God in all of this? And why didn't he rescue me when I needed him most? Well, in the Gospel of Mark, during a terrifying storm, we find the disciples perhaps struggling with similar questions. And I think that there is much to be gleaned from this story as we face our own unexpected storms. So hear the word of the Lord from Mark 6:45 through 52. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on a mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The Gospel of Mark has been called by some the New Exodus, because in many ways it parallels the narrative arc and the events of Exodus. For example, in Exodus, God provides quail and manna for the Israelites when they're in the wilderness, literally bread from heaven. And then in this story, just before this story I just read, Jesus provides a miraculous meal for over 5,000 from just 5 loaves and 2 fish. In the hour of greatest need, God, through Moses, split the Reed Sea so that the Israelites could walk over it across dry land to escape the Egyptians. And here in Mark, God and Jesus does not split the sea, but he walks on it toward the disciples in their own hour of greatest need. So there's obviously a lot going on in this story in connection to other stories in Mark and to Exodus. But let's start by first just looking at this story and going through it together to see what we can discover. So Jesus, who just a few chapters earlier in Mark invited these same disciples to come and follow him, now tells them that they must get into a boat and go on ahead without him. We don't know if the disciples knew a storm was coming, but we do know that several of them were fishermen, so they probably knew the weather patterns and that storms could arise pretty quickly and unexpectedly on the Sea of Galilee in the late afternoon. We also know that in ancient Jewish worldview, the sea was thought of as chaotic and even terrifying. There is this Hebrew word, tehom, that refers to the great deep of the primordial waters of creation in Genesis. For the people of this day and this story, the deep waters, the sea, it was the great unknown, an uncontrollable place of chaos, of tehom. And as evening approached, it's into this great unknown that Jesus has the disciples get into a boat and cross across without him. I wonder what it must have felt like to be in a wooden boat in the middle of a dark and stormy night, crossing a body of water that's about 7.5 miles wide. The waves are crashing and the wind is howling, and the disciples are making very little progress. We know this because the text tells us that Jesus, who is ashore, sees them struggling against the wind. And yet, he does not come toward them until the 4th watch of the night. That's between 3 and 6 a.m. And if we assume that Jesus dismissed the crowd, the feeding of the 5,000, that crowd, if he dismissed them before it got dark, then the disciples had been rowing for probably 7 hours or more. So one of the things that stands out to me in this passage is that the disciples were in this boat and in this storm, not because they disobeyed Jesus, but because they obeyed Jesus. The text says that Jesus made them get into the boat, but they could have refused. Actually, the phrase in Greek suggests that not only did Jesus use unusual force to compel them to get into the boat, but the disciples show reluctancy. But still, in the end, they get in the boat, and as they're struggling with the oars against the wind, I can only imagine that they might have been frustrated, maybe even angry at Jesus for putting them in this position. Where was he now? And how on earth were they going to get themselves out of this mess? And then finally, sometime after 3 a.m., Jesus comes to them walking on the water. Now, I don't have to tell you that generally, actually never, people don't really walk on the water. And in fact, within ancient Near Eastern mythology, only the gods and the divine could control the water. This is certainly true in Jewish tradition as well. There was only one who could control the tehom, the chaotic water, and it was God, who spoke in Genesis in the very beginning to the waters, saying, "Let the waters under heaven be gathered together into one place." Order out of tehom. We find then that the terrified disciples assume Jesus must be a ghost, because for them it would indeed take something divine, something not of this world, to do what he was doing. So this act of walking on water, it clearly stands out as different from Jesus's other miracles so far, to the point where the disciples don't even recognize Jesus. And so I want to take a few minutes to explore the significance behind the act of Jesus walking on the water. In Job 9, we find an interesting passage that sheds light on this connection of the divine to water. God alone, Job says, stretches out the heavens, and treads on the waves of the sea. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. God treads on the waves of the sea. When we make this connection, we see very clearly that the very act of Jesus walking on the water has a unique purpose to point to Jesus's divinity. He's not just a prophet or a rabbi or even the Messiah. He is divine. But then comes probably the most confusing part of this story, at least for me. As if walking on water was not enough, the text tells us that Jesus meant to pass by them. What? That seems strange and not at all helpful. Why would he intentionally want to pass by his desperate disciples when they needed him most? You can imagine any superhero movie where the scene is set for the big climactic battle. The enemy is standing there and the hero approaches, probably in slow motion, wearing a cool superhero outfit. They're the only one that can rescue the world, that can slay this enemy. And then he or she just keeps walking right on by the battle scene. That's not what heroes are supposed to do, right? I haven't seen very many movies where this is the case. But if we read on in chapter 9 of Job, Job expands on his description of the divine. And he says, God alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. When he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. When he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. While we might be prone to see passing by someone as avoidant or showing disinterest, here in Job and throughout the Old Testament, God is portrayed through the act of passing by. For example, in Exodus, the firstborn is spared by the angel of the Lord passing over them. And then later, God reveals himself to Moses on Mount Sinai by passing by and showing him just his back. And Elijah has a very similar experience. In each of these situations, we see that passing by is not God disassociating himself from his people, but rather it's one of the ways God interacts with his people and even saves his people. When Jesus walks on the water, when Jesus is about to pass by, that very act declares who he really is. According to Job, or according to the Job passage, God has been treading on the waves of the sea since the very beginning. The miracle is that the disciples can now see and experience the God revealed in Jesus, who is about to pass by them. That which Job said could not be perceived, the disciples are now able to perceive. Except they don't. Instead, they cry out with fear, thinking he's a ghost. Jesus responds with compassion, coming even closer and saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." In the Greek, this phrase, "it is I," is ego eimi, and that is directly translated just as I am. Take courage, I am. Do not be afraid. The same God who spoke to Moses in his fear and insecurity and doubt, saying, "I am who I am, and I will be with you as you go into Egypt." That same God now stands on the waves of the sea saying, I am here. I am enough for you. I am the great I am. I am the answer. It is in the storm that the divinity of Jesus is fully revealed, and the love of God is on full display as he enters into the storm with the disciples. He's in the wind and the waves with them. He doesn't stop it from land. He goes in closer to be with them. Apparently, Jesus' first priority was not to immediately calm the storm, but to reveal his identity, to reveal this identity as divine, and to speak truth into the arguably more dangerous storm of fear and doubt that raged in the disciples' hearts. because it's only after revealing himself, first in action and then in word, that Jesus gets into the boat and the wind ceases. It's almost like the actual calming of the storm is a secondary thought to the rest of what is going on in this passage. The natural order comes under Jesus' control easily, but the disciples, Mark tells us, were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. This final verse is a strange one, and it raises a couple of questions for us. First, why were the disciples' hearts hardened? And second, what is the connection with hard hearts to loaves of bread? To get at this more fully, we need to look back at what happened before the storm, the events that led Jesus to actually put those disciples in the boat and send them away. So in the prior story of the feeding of the 5,000, we learn that Jesus and his disciples had retreated away from the crowds. They were trying to find space to be alone, to rest. The text tells us that they were so busy, they hadn't even had time to eat. And it's in this moment, as they're alone, that a large crowd of over 5,000 people come and find Jesus and the disciples. It's any introvert's nightmare. And Jesus has compassion on them. By contrast, the disciples want to send the crowds away to find their own food. But Jesus tells them that they should be the ones to give the crowd food. And they argue with Jesus and say it would cost more than half a year's wages to buy enough loaves to feed such a crowd. And surely they shouldn't spend their money in that way. Following this exchange, Jesus asks them to bring whatever loaves they do have. And so they produce 5 loaves and an extra 2 fish. After blessing it, it becomes enough to feed everyone with plenty of leftovers. And it's now that our story begins, where Mark says immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. And so, with these 2 stories in mind, we see that twice in back-to-back episodes, the disciples have been placed into what seems to be, in their minds, impossible situations. Both times their attempts to face the challenge in their own wisdom and ability ignored what they already knew about Jesus, the one who has previously in Mark healed the sick, cast out demons, even raised someone from the dead. All these things would seem quite impossible, but for Jesus, they were possible. Instead, their hearts are hardened to who he really is and what he has come to do, what he is capable of doing. And they don't look beyond themselves and their own capabilities in these situations. So when I first started looking at this storm passage, it almost looked like Jesus was the one ignoring the disciples as he stood safely on land watching them and then was about to pass them by. But I think now that we've gone through the stories and see these connections, we can see that it's actually the disciples who don't look to Jesus. And yet, in spite of this, Jesus, the great I Am, still comes to them, treading on the waves of the sea. He doesn't rebuke them for not asking for help sooner. In fact, they never ask for help in the first place. He doesn't give them a 3-point sermon for how they need to learn to be stronger and have more faith and pray harder next time. Despite their failure to respond appropriately or even understand what is going on, God stands on the waves in the person of Jesus, first revealing himself to them, and then, and only then, rescuing them, calming the wind and the waves. I think when we are in our own storms, it's really easy to focus on the power of Jesus to intervene and not realize that the value of the storm is the opportunity for God to reveal himself in deeper ways to us, or in ways that we didn't understand or see before. This was certainly the case for me as I cried out every night my freshman year for God to just stop the storm, to end my pain and get me out of there. With Jesus, an experience of chaos and terror has the potential to be transformed into holy ground that provides the greatest opportunity to come to know God in Jesus and to trust him in more intimate and deeper ways. even as the waves are still crashing down on you. I think it's the same with any friendship or relationship. I have found that throughout my life, the friends who I trust the most, who I feel closest to, are the ones who have gone through challenging times with me. Enduring a week of all-nighters to pass our finals, cleaning through 5 years of filth and garbage in the church's youth room, or maybe sitting with each other as we cried through the end of relationships and mourned the loss of loved ones. Going through experiences like these bond people together. Maybe you can see the faces of those special people now in your own lives, in your memories. Hardships have the potential to unite people together. And it's into our hardships, into the loneliness, the financial struggles, the broken hearts and shattered relationships, the unexpected diagnoses, even the dashed expectations of a homesick college freshman, that Jesus enters into and seeks us out, seeks relationship with us, inviting us to know and trust him in a deeper and longer lasting way. He wants more for us than just the transformation of our situation. Because as we saw at the end of our story, that was not enough to change the disciples' hardened hearts, to provide real, lasting faith and peace. And so I think that we can actually take hope from this strange ending, because despite their misunderstanding and hardened hearts, Jesus never abandoned them. And likewise, he will never abandon us. He continues to seek us out, providing the kind of peace that we can have in us no matter what life situations bring. God is always passing by, and the more we get to know Jesus, the more we can perceive his consistent, powerful, and ever passing presence. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.